1. The war economy and the development of military industries. World War II, 1939–1945, profoundly altered the structure of the global economy. Unlike World War I, which was characterized by limited mobilization in some countries, WBI demanded total war efforts. States redirected their entire economies toward the production of military goods, infrastructure, and services. The concept of a war economy became central to national survival and victory. Governments increased their control over production, labor, and capital, and public expenditure surged. The state became the dominant economic actor. In the United States, the War Production Board coordinated the conversion of civilian industries into wartime production. Automobile factories produced tanks and aircraft. Consumer goods were limited, and rationing became widespread. By 1944, military expenditures accounted for over 40% of the U.S. gross national product (GNP), and unemployment, which had plagued the U.S. during the Great Depression, virtually disappeared. Germany, under the Nazi regime, implemented a tightly controlled war economy overseen by figures like Albert Speer. The use of forced labor and plundered resources from occupied territories sustained its military-industrial complex. Japan pursued a similar path, heavily centralizing control over strategic resources and increasing its imperial exploitation in East Asia. In the Soviet Union, the centrally planned economy demonstrated its capacity for massive wartime mobilization. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains to protect them from German advance, and production was ramped up under extraordinary hardship. Soviet industrial output was critical in the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. Wartime scientific and industrial advances such as radar, synthetic materials, nuclear technology, and computing laid the foundation for the post-war technological boom. However, the war also left much of Europe and Asia in ruins. Thus, the challenge in 1945 was not only to restore pre-war economies, but to rebuild and rethink the structure of the international economic system itself. 2. The Bretton Woods system and the establishment of international monetary order. The collapse of international finance and trade during the interwar period, exacerbated by the Great Depression, competitive devaluations, and protectionism, convinced post-war planners that a new international monetary order was necessary to avoid another economic catastrophe. In July 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design this system. The result was the Bretton Woods system, a landmark framework that would shape global economic relations for the next 3 decades. The key objectives of Bretton Woods were to ensure exchange rate stability, facilitate international trade, and promote economic growth. 2 major institutions emerged from the agreement. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, designed to oversee fixed exchange rates and provide temporary financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments problems. Its primary function was to maintain currency stability and prevent competitive devaluations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, later part of the World Bank, created to provide long-term loans for post-war reconstruction and development, particularly in Europe and later in the Global South. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar became the anchor of the global monetary system, convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar within a narrow band. This gold-dollar standard established a stable and predictable environment for international transactions. However, the system also placed enormous responsibility on the United States, which had to maintain large gold reserves and ensure global liquidity. U.S. dominance in trade, finance, and production in the immediate post-war years enabled the system to function effectively. The dollar became not only the global reserve currency, but also the foundation of international confidence in economic recovery. While the Bretton Woods system fostered economic stability and growth in the 1950s and 1960s, it faced increasing pressure in the 1970s, eventually collapsing when President Nixon suspended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971. Nonetheless, it remains a key historical model of international monetary cooperation. 3. The Marshall Plan and the Reconstruction of Europe. In the aftermath of World War II, much of Europe lay in physical and economic ruin. Infrastructure was destroyed, industrial capacity was shattered, and agricultural production was insufficient. Political instability, inflation, and hunger threatened the fragile peace. In this context, the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, ERP, was launched in 1947 by the United States under Secretary of State George C. Marshall. It provided over $13 billion, equivalent to more than $150 billion today, in economic aid to 16 Western European countries between 1948 and 1952. The goals were both economic and geopolitical: to rebuild war-torn economies, contain the spread of communism, and foster transatlantic solidarity. The plan was revolutionary in scope and implementation. Rather than impose U.S. control, it encouraged European cooperation through the establishment of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC. A precursor to today's OECD, funds were used to modernize industry, stabilize currencies, increase productivity, and invest in transportation, energy, and agriculture. Key impacts of the Marshall Plan included rapid economic recovery. European industrial production rose by over 40% during the program period. Political stability. Democratic governments were consolidated in Western Europe, while communist influence was curtailed. Integration foundations. The OEEC became a vehicle for economic integration, eventually contributing to the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and the European Economic Community in 1957. The Marshall Plan is often credited with helping to lay the foundation for the golden age of capitalism, 1950-1973 in Western Europe, a period of high growth, low unemployment, and rising living standards. However, it also symbolized the deepening divide between East and West, as the Soviet Union rejected Marshall aid and imposed its own model in Eastern Europe. 4. The Cold War economic systems, capitalism versus communism. The geopolitical division of the world after 1945 gave rise to two competing economic systems aligned with the emerging superpowers: capitalism under U.S. leadership and communism under the Soviet Union. The Cold War was as much an ideological and economic struggle as it was a military standoff. The capitalist bloc U.S. and Western Europe. Capitalist economies were based on private property, free markets, and democratic institutions. The post-war capitalist world was characterized by mixed economies. States often intervened to regulate demand, ensure full employment, and expand welfare provisions. Keynesianism. Global trade and investment. Encouraged through institutions like GATT General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, and the World Bank. Consumer capitalism. Rising wages and productivity fueled mass consumption, especially in the United States and Western Europe. Capitalist economies grew rapidly during the post-war decades. The economic miracles of Germany, France, Italy, and Japan demonstrated how state-guided capitalism and international support could rebuild and transform former wartime economies. B. The Communist bloc, Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. Communist economies operated under central planning, with the state owning the means of production. The Soviet model prioritized heavy industry, collectivized agriculture, and political control over economic decision-making. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, established in 1949, was the Soviet response to Western economic integration. It coordinated economic policy and trade among Eastern Bloc countries. However, the system struggled with inefficiencies, technological lag, and lack of innovation due to the absence of market signals. Despite initial growth in the 1950s, communist economies stagnated by the 1970s and fell behind in productivity, consumer goods, and living standards. The rigidities of central planning and resistance to reform led to mounting internal crises. Conclusion: economic legacy of the post-war order. World War II and the ensuing post-war Reconstruction period shaped the global economy for decades. The rise of the military-industrial complex, the creation of international financial institutions, the success of the Marshall Plan, and the ideological economic division of the Cold War world all contributed to a new economic order. The Bretton Woods institutions, though later reformed, still remain cornerstones of global economic governance. The Marshall Plan set a precedent for economic aid and regional integration. The Cold War rivalry gave rise to contrasting models of development and influenced economic policies across the global South. While the Cold War ultimately ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the economic structures and ideas born from the post-war Reconstruction era continue to inform contemporary debates on globalization, development, and international cooperation.